Hi, Misha here, and kind of with my ongoing re-examination of aircraft, plus showing a new one or two that I picked up since the last time, I thought it would be fun to talk about the Vought, later Ling Timco Vought LTV, F8 Crusader, and A7 Corsair. As far as the F8s, we have kind of two configurations here. One in an air-to-air mode, and one in more of a close air support. These were flown by the U.S. Navy and Marines. And in the A7, being an attack aircraft, we have a U.S. Air Force, and then two U.S. Navy versions. One in a kind of bombing run, one in an Iron Hand configuration. All but the center one here are Century wings. This one's a Gemini, but all are 1/72 scale die-cast and pretty cool models in my opinion. So, yeah. I couldn't really find a way to split these up because the two aircraft are so closely connected. So we'll just do them together. Hope that's okay. But with that, let's dive in and go back to the 1950s and really the deepest part of the Korean War, when the U.S. Navy desperately needed a new and up-to-date jet fighter. Our first 1/72 scale die-cast model from Century Wings is the F8, and I have it in more of a pure fighter configuration because that's where it began. Going all the way back to 1952, the Navy was lagging behind a little bit with the Air Force. Of course, carrier operations were a different environment from land bases, but they needed to replace their old F9s and whatnot. So they issued specifications that year for a new supersonic carrier-based jet. It needed to be able to exceed Mach 1.2. But to operate on the carrier, it needed to have a low landing speed of about 100 miles per hour. It also needed to be able to carry modern weapons and be armed with 20mm cannon. The Navy was a little ahead of the Air Force in recognizing that, and there were plenty of other features too, of course, duration of flight and all that for a carrier. Those are kind of the critical ones. And 8 or 9 companies submitted design proposals in March of '53. So the Korean War is still going on. The Navy's taking a look at what's there. They're taking feedback from pilots, seeing what's happening in the war. And they kind of have two finalists, one from Grumman and one from Vought. In May, the Vought proposal, known at the time as V383, the team was led by John Russell Clark at Vought, for what it's worth. It was picked as the primary thing. 3 prototypes were ordered. These are designated as the F8U. But it's kind of a hedge on the bets. The Grumman proposal was also ordered as the XF11F. I've done a comparison in the past, the F8 versus the F11. I don't feel like doing it in this video. We're just going to focus in on this, but needless to say, that's where they were at. So 3 prototypes were ordered in May. Well, the design was selected in May. The prototypes were ordered in June, and really the process of finalizing the design and building the prototypes went exceedingly smoothly. So much so that by February of 1955, the first prototype was rolled out of the factory and was made ready for its first flight. And that would occur on March 25, 1955, and on its very first flight, the XF8U prototype would exceed the sound barrier. It would go supersonic, past Mach 1. Not bad. The second prototype would fly at the end of September of that same year and also exceed the speed of sound. And things were going so smoothly, essentially the third prototype would become the first pre-production or even really production model aircraft, and it would be built. And these were really exceeding expectations. The F11 was meeting them barely, but the F8, and by the way, yes, I know F8U, but was exceeding them. Therefore, by 1956, testing and trials were put underway, and it was kind of given over to fleet. This was meant to replace the F7U Cutlass, the gutless Cutlass, which was an underperformer from the get-go. And I don't believe anyone makes that in die-cast. But in April of 56, carrier trials began. And after that, the second half of the year is given over towards weapon trials. And from there, in August, they would have quite a record set when one of these would be the first American jet to exceed 1,000 miles per hour. And this would be followed by a supersonic transoceanic flight in July of 1957 by a pilot who at the time was relatively unknown, John Glenn Jr. So yeah, he flew a variant, actually it was the reconnaissance, the camera variant of this aircraft. And so it was put into full squadron service, and Vought would continue manufacturing these up until 1964. So what is this aircraft? Overall length is about 54 feet, with a wingspan of just under 36 feet. Relatively large for that day and time. Single seat, single engine design. It actually used the J57 engine taken from the F100 Super Sabre. It did have afterburner, but it wasn't, you couldn't throttle it. It was just on or off. Remember how I said the requirement was at least Mach 1.2? Well, this blew it out of the water, exceeding Mach 1.8 top speed. But it could cruise comfortably at under 600 miles per hour. And it had a maximum altitude of 58,000 feet, which is actually quite good for a carrier-based aircraft. Speaking of carrier, one interesting feature was the variable instance wing. This was done to fulfill the relatively low landing speed requirement, again for a carrier. Essentially, the whole wing could pivot up about 7 degrees. And kind of neat on this model that you can do that. See if I can do it here on the stand. There we go. It does rotate up. The wing is metal on this. It also had an all-moving tail, which again this Century Wings does do. Right here. And they are geared together. It's a metal tail as well. All for the performance we need. Bonk. And as the Navy required, it was armed with 20mm cannon, four Colt Mark 12s, each with 125 rounds, which would lend itself to the name Last of the Gunfighters. But from the get-go, different weapons were allowed for. Initially, it was to carry 32 folding fin rockets in an under tray. But during this aircraft's development, the AIM-9 Sidewinder was created by the Navy, and so very quickly the rocket pack was removed, the unguided rockets, and the early guided missiles. Early versions just had one on each cheek pylon, but later versions had this Y-shaped pylon. We see something similar on the F100 Super Sabre. So 2 and later 4 AIM-9Bs. The AIM-9A was really just a proof of concept and testing model. The B was the first production model. And again, interestingly, the famous Sidewinder was started not by the Air Force, but by the Navy. And this was one of their first jets to use it and designed for it. And just a pretty hot rod performer, for better or worse. But certainly a leap forward from the old F9. Of course, as I'm sure you know, in 1962, this is when the common naming system came into effect, and of course the F8U became the F8, starting with, of course, the A model and working its way through the E model and so on. The F11F became the F11, although very few were actually in naval service. The backup wasn't needed, and this was accepted for service and would serve through Vietnam. Thanks to the smooth development and testing phase and the exceeding performance, the first squadron started to receive the new F8 at the tail end of 1956, and by 1957 training was well underway. I will have to say, it had a reputation known as the Ensign Eliminator, being a difficult and somewhat unforgiving aircraft to fly. But a lot of that just had to do with the previous training and jumping from the F9 to this, a bit of a hot rod. Once skilled pilots got a handle on it, they could do very good things with it. It would have its first kind of shakedown cruise on board USS Saratoga in 1957. They would go to the Mediterranean. But it really would not see service use until the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. For 6 weeks, these would fly, the reconnaissance version I should say, the RF-8, would fly thousands of hours of reconnaissance missions twice a day, very dangerous over Cuban airspace, taking photos of the whole situation. So that was really its first big deployment. And from there, it would go into Vietnam. But of course, we do have variants. This is an F8E, the essentially ultimate version produced. What about the A, B, C, and D? Again, I'm going to use the 1962 designations. The F8U-1 was the original, later renamed the F8A, and this was the first production model. It was a day fighter. It did have the folding fin rocket tray, and no radar. They built over 300, but they could do better. The F8B was the first to have radar equipped and a new radome. It was considered limited all-weather capability. It was a very early naval radar, and it would start to see the first of the uprated engines as well. But it was just mostly a test bed, but they would still build 130. From there, the F8C, which actually was first tested before the B, would really be the first to try to redo the design. They would go to the Y pylon carrying 4 AIM-9s instead of 2. They would also add fins under the fuselage in the back here to try to fix some stability and yaw issues, and continue to uprate and refine the engine systems. And from there, the F8D would go to a better, newer radar system, and this would be the version that got rid of the rocket pack entirely, replacing it with an auxiliary fuel tank and other ability upgrades. And then finally, the F8E, this version here, it would have a further improved radar with a better nose cone system. It would be true all-weather capable, and by this point, with the uprated engine and other things, its carriage abilities would be improved. Earlier versions could carry about 4,000 pounds of external stores. The later versions, the Ds and the Es, could carry up to 5,000 pounds. And production would continue through 1964, with the last ones delivered to the U.S. Navy that year. Although there would be a run of F8Es done for the French Navy, designed especially for their carriers and to carry their missiles. Those would be the final ones made, the F8E FN, in 1965. In total, Vought would assemble 1,219, and this was enough to let every U.S. carrier serving in Vietnam be equipped with the Crusader. And frankly, for the first half of the war, it was the Navy's best dogfighter, hence the other nickname it had, the MiG Master. Speaking of other, this was not just designed for the Navy, it was also designed for the Marines. So here's another version from Century Wings that has some ordnance hanging off. On the chin pylons, It could also carry Zuni rocket packs instead of not just the Sidewinders. Still has its 4 20mm guns. And under the wings it had one hard point each, and could carry Mark 81, Mark 82 bombs. It could carry heavier 500, even 1,000-pound bombs. And the later versions, like the E, could even carry 2 AGM-12 bullpup missiles, an early air-to-surface guided missile of interesting reputation. But the U.S. Marine Corps operated this more as a close air support plane from land bases in South Vietnam, which did give them a little bit better carriage ability. And this is where we start to see it being used as that. So it wasn't always just an air superiority fighter. Now, the F8, because it was on every carrier, it could even operate from the smaller Essex classes, not just the large ones. These were there on August 3 with the in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, recent history has cast some interesting doubt and questions on whatever happened there. But one thing that's not a doubt, the F8 was there, and they did attack North Vietnamese gunboats, actually sinking at least one with gunfire and missiles. So they were there at the beginning of the war. And then in April of 1965, they would be the first Navy fighters to engage the MiG-17, and they would go on to engage the MiG-21. Now, this was often called the last of the gunfighters, and it did shoot down around 4 enemy jets with its cannon, but the Colt Mark 12 wasn't the best gun in the world. It could jam up, and by that point, the AIM-9B this had, well, it was doing a lot better than the Air Force's AIM-4 Falcon, I'll tell you that. So most of their air-to-air kills, they were credited with shooting down 18 to 19 MiGs, including a couple of MiG-21s. They were done with the missile. And this was, the Navy's best dogfighter. They started to replace these by 1967 with the F4 Phantom. But it kind of remained the fact that the Phantom was an interceptor / multi-role. It could certainly carry more ordnance. Again, this could carry only 5,000 pounds. The Phantom fully laden up to 18,000. But the Phantom was an interceptor. This was a dogfighter. So in some instances, its slower speed but better turning was better against, say, a MiG-17. So it continued to see service throughout Vietnam, even though it was starting to get replaced in the last half of the war. Only a handful were lost to other enemy aircraft, just 4 or 5. But in total, the Navy lost about 170, most to accidents or ground fire. I believe over 50 were to ground fire, and counterbalance everything else. So they were lost. And I should also mention the RF-8, the photo reconnaissance version, which proved useful over at Cuba, continued to be very useful to the Navy throughout Vietnam as their carrier-based reconnaissance aircraft. But eventually, the F-4B and later F-4J Phantoms replaced these in active service as time would go on. Everything has its day and time. But not bad for a plane whose heritage goes back to the early 50s, frankly. I think it's the fact that Vought made it exceed expectations that kept it around as long as it was. These would continue in frontline U.S. Navy, Marine Corps service through the 70s, slowly but surely being replaced out until officially retired in 1976. And then the reserves would roll them down by 82. And the final ones, they were the RF-8 variants, were out of the reserves by 1986, 1987 for first the Navy, then the Marines. But yeah, at a time, this was the longest serving fighter the Navy had. Of course, later that record would be busted up, but it did serve for quite a while. But it was a dogfighter in a changing world, and it would evolve and change into the second half of this video's topic. It's time to talk about the Slough, and this is also the only non-Century model today. This was from Gemini, still 172 scale diecast. and it's of a U.S. Navy A7 Corsair 2. So this is obviously based on the F8 Crusader, but is a totally different bird. Going back to 1962, the U.S. Navy begins planning to replace the A4 Skyhawk, which was its light attack aircraft. And in 63, they release requirements. It was to be subsonic, have a relatively good weapons carriage ability, range, endurance, all that stuff. But most importantly, it was to be based on a pre-existing design. So this would save time and money because budget was a thing. And the usual suspects submitted proposals: Douglas, North American, Grumman, and Vought, whose proposal was based on the F8. And in February of 1964, the Vought proposal was selected, and March 19, a contract was issued for the YA7 prototype, and they would get to work constructing it. And it would be first test flown September 27, 1965. And soon the Vought name would change with a new partnership to Ling Timco Vought LTV, which would be what this would be produced under, with production ranging from 1966 to 1984 with full production style. And they would build 1,569, including the prototype or the pre-production models, meaning technically more of these were built. But then again, maybe there was more to be offered for an attack aircraft because of the Vietnam War. So what do we have here? This is shorter than the F8 at about 46 feet, but has more of a wingspan at about 39 feet. Hence the name Slough, short, little, ugly fucker, given by the U.S. Navy pilots. It used an early version of the same engine as the F-111 Aardvark, and for that matter the first F-14s, but it did not have an afterburner, so it was solidly subsonic. It could reach about 690 miles per hour clean and about 650 with ordnance on it. Altitude mattered a lot. This was optimized for low level performance too. Max altitude was just 42,000 feet, but again, yeah, you're not going to deliver a whole lot unless you're close to the ground at this era. It has the two chin pylons from the F8, but now they just carry defensive missiles, one AIM-9, first Bs, later Ls on each, with its main ordnance on 6 underwing hardpoints. And it, on paper, could carry up to 15,000 pounds, but in reality, rarely did, except for like air shows. Still, significant increase, 3 times what the F8 could, and almost as much as aircraft like the A6, the Navy's medium bomber, and the F4 Phantom. And this had a lot better fuel efficiency. And it also had one 20mm Gatling cannon, an M61, with over 1,000 rounds of fully loaded up. So we got rid of the 4 Colt Mark 12s, but we're going to that. Typically it carried dumb bombs, Mark 82s, Mark 83s, but it could carry more intelligence besides. It also wasn't just a simple aircraft. It was the first U.S. Navy aircraft to have a heads-up display. It had a very advanced navigation system, map system. It had very good autopilot. It even had a data link so it could do hands-off landing on carriers if needs be. And it had a very advanced bomb delivery system for this day and time, or more pinpoint accuracy, that kind of thing. So yeah, in fact the cockpit was quite complicated. But then again, it was a single-seater meant to be an attack aircraft. They were trying to give the pilot as easy of a time as they possibly could. But yeah, this one here from Gemini, this has the bombs under the wings. Pretty straightforward. But let's talk about its service in Vietnam. The first of these were delivered to the Navy in 1966, and squadrons declared themselves initially ready at the beginning of February 1967, and the first A7 Corsairs would go on a cruise on the USS Ranger that year into Vietnam. By the way, LTV Vought, they picked the name Corsair because they'd already had earlier aircraft with that name. But like I said, this is the A7E. How did we get there from the A? And what other mission profiles did the Navy fly it in? Switching out for another Navy A7. Yeah, these went with Ranger and were first put into combat December of 1967, and very quickly flew mission after mission after mission for the Navy, dropping bombs, sure, but this one I've set up in a iron hand role, essentially the Navy's version of a SEAD mission. And interestingly, while these could carry two, some sources even say 300-gallon or 370-gallon tanks, this has only one on it with a pod on the other, and that is correct. And while you often can see just two AGM-45 Shrikes, 4 could and were carried. So this one really doesn't like radar installations. I just thought it'd be fun to put extra missiles on it, showing a different type of mission profile, not just dropping bombs. Quite interesting to me, I think. The Shrike has its own thing. In a lot of ways, it was very similar to the AIM-7 Sparrow. But anywho, the original A7A was actually well liked, kind of the opposite of the F8. It was considered a good handler, relatively slow performance, forgiving, but it was a little underpowered, and it had trouble skidding around on wet runways. And I don't know why a carrier would be wet, but apparently some of them were. So the A7B would quickly be introduced with an upgraded engine and other improvements made for landing on wet surfaces. And the new version really proved to be very fuel efficient, better duration missions, hence why these usually only carried one, at most two, external fuel tanks. And some missions you'll see them no fuel tanks at all. That's pretty good for a naval aircraft. And those were the primary Navy versions in service, 67, 68, 69 in that interim. But this is the A7E, which came into service in 1970. Before we can talk about it, though, we have to talk about the A7D. Before we can really talk about the U.S. Navy's A7E, we have to talk about the U.S. Air Force's A7D. An aircraft the Air Force really didn't want, even though it was successful, and retired it as quick as they could after Vietnam. Anywho, the U.S. Army was not allowed to operate fixed-wing aircraft. That was the purview of the Air Force. And the Army needed a close air support role from the Air Force. And the Air Force was trying to use the F-100 Super Sabre, especially the D variant. But the Army felt this Super Sabre just wasn't really well suited to this and wanted the Air Force to adopt a new close air support light attack aircraft. And it was proposed to the Air Force that they go with the A7, but they pushed back. This is in 1964-65. They'd already acquiesced and adopted the F4 Phantom, which was originally a Navy design. They really didn't want to do this. But Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara put his foot down, and therefore in November of 1965, the Air Force announced they would be going with a customized version of the A7, soon to be known as the A7D, and a prototype would be constructed as the YA7D to kind of meet their needs. The first version would fly in April of 1968 and introduce several changes. It had many customized things just to suit Air Force ways of doing things. For example, the refueling mechanisms and probes were different from the Navy. It also had an improved radar, other avionics improvements, and whereas the original A and B models had a single 20mm cannon, the D model here had that M61 rotary 20mm Vulcan type cannon. So I guess I should have mentioned that earlier, but anyway, improved cannon. And of course its weapons carriage abilities was improved. For example, carrying the AIM-65, the Maverick missile, that was unique to the Air Force version, although they never would use theirs in the Cedro as far as I know. So yeah, and they often would carry 2 fuel tanks because of taking off from land airstrips. Just several other avionics improvements. And then in September of that same year, a further improved version with an uprated engine would first test fly, and that would make it into the final design in 1969, and it would be adopted for service and appear in Vietnam in 1972. And these would be used to replace the old A1, which was really wearing out, and the F100 and a few others, and kind of take over the search and rescue role. Close air support, of course, as the Army needed, and working on strike missions actually alongside the Navy. Even though the Air Force didn't really want this aircraft, it proved to have a very accurate bombing system. Even if it couldn't carry as much as some other aircraft, it ended up delivering the second highest number of bombs on North Vietnam compared to the B-52 at number 1. And despite all their protests, it had a good record and would serve for the last handful of years of the war. And it also kind of made the Navy jealous. And thus we do get the A7E. This had pretty much the same updates, the new engine, the new avionics, the new radar as the A7Ds. You really only differed in having the Navy-specific systems like their fueling. But yeah, same abilities. It even had the M61 cannon. And the Navy was happy. The first example would test fly in 1969 and then be adopted for service the following year and start to enter in, I think they first went to Vietnam on USS America at the very end of 1970. And they would really start to make a name for themselves with Operation Linebacker 2 at the beginning of 1973, flying a number of missions for the remainder of the war. And that's what we have here, of course, is this aircraft. If you're wondering about the A7C, it was the interim aircraft that had the avionics and cannon updates and new radar, but had the old engine. So not many C's were built. It was just a stopgap. And so they were both essentially flying the same aircraft, one from carriers, one from land bases. You might be thinking about the U.S. Marines. Obviously, they flew the F8, as we've already talked about, but they did not fly the A7. They rejected it. They continued to fly the F8 for some missions, as well as the older A4, and then they would eventually jump to the AV8, their own version of the Harrier. So, what happened at the end of Vietnam for these and afterwards? These two would actually end the war together on a joint mission in May of 1975 against the Khmer Rouge. Both Ds and Es would fly close air support during a hostage and rescue mission and then wrap things up going home. The Navy would lose 98 A7s during the war. Of course, they were flying them longer. The Air Force would lose under 6. Again, they flew them for a much shorter time. Then again, they flew a lot of missions in those couple of years they had them. So good record in the war. And they were used for different things. Again, these were search and rescue, close support. These were used for bombing missions as well as Iron Hand missions. So ordnance layout would be different. And their fates after the war would be different as well. 27 squadrons would use the A7 as a light attack aircraft in the U.S. Navy during the war, and many would hang on to their aircraft throughout the 1970s. They were used to provide close air support in 1983 during the invasion of Grenada, and they were also used over Lebanon in the 1980s. And they would be stationed in the Persian Gulf region in August of 1990 for Operation Desert Shield, and used actively in Operation Desert Storm that January. But this would be their last active combat mission for the U.S. Navy. After they came home from that war, quite successfully, they would be officially retired in May. And again, the Marines didn't have any, so that was that. So a good service record. They served for nearly 25 years all told. 20 of those with the best A7E model. What about the Air Force? It's a little more colorful. By 1975, the Air Force not only was already happy and willing to replace these, they had a replacement in mind, at least on the drawing board, the venerable A10 Warthog. Yes, I know Warthog's not its official name, it's the Warthog. And so they would start switching these out as soon as Warthogs came in, sending them to the National Guard and cycling them out. Interestingly, Congress at that time really wanted to keep the LTV factory up and running, so they essentially strong-armed the Air Force again into buying more of these. A two-seat training version, the A7K, was developed and put into production in 1978, and the Air Force would buy a handful of these between that time and 1984. They didn't need them, they didn't want them, so they mostly went to the Air Guard, and one was given per squad for training. And they actually found some use with the A7Ds and A7Ks as a deception during the F117, the Nighthawk project, between 80 and 89. They used these as a kind of cover for those hangars and everything going on. They also found that it actually kind of handled like the Nighthawk, because it is a subsonic attack aircraft, and the Nighthawk, even though it's called a fighter, actually isn't. So yeah, they were around, and even though the mainline Air Force, the frontline Air Force, got rid of them by 81, 83, the Air Guard would continue to train and fly with them, and their final operation would be in 1989, Panama Operation Just Cause. They would fly as close air support there, and then the Air Force would officially retire theirs, effectively in 91, but on paper, the Air Guard would finally hand theirs in 1993. So a little bit later, but in reality, 1990, 91 is when they were technically out of service. And of course, they were cleared to carry a wide range of ordnance. This one's got the tanks, and I think these are Mark 82s. I don't think it has 83s on this one. No, 82s. And of course, it's got the Mavericks. A Navy version would not have a Maverick. Then again, an Air Force version would not have Shrike. Some sources say that these carried the AGM-88 Harm. That would have definitely been late in their service if they did. So that I would point that out. As I said, the Air Force would replace with the A-10, and the Navy would begin replacing with the F-18 Hornet, a multi-purpose aircraft in the 1980s. Not bad a run though. This allowed the replacement of older A4s, A1s, F100s, and even kind of relieved some of the stress on the F4 Phantoms and A6 Intruders. But I just kind of felt like doing this video. I probably should have done the A4 revisit again, but I felt like talking F8s and A7s. What do you think? I really like the look of the F8. It's that old meets new. In some aspects, the F8 looks like a 50s style fighter, because it was. But you can tell it was kind of giving the future. For example, it has kind of the aerial rule fuselage, and it's a much larger aircraft. And even though it was called the last of the gunfighters, carrying 4 AIM-9s at the time was actually pretty forward-thinking. The Bs would be used in NAM. Of course, the AIM-9Ls would come around later. And again, it could carry French Matra missiles in their service. And a few other nations used it besides. I don't know, I just really like this aircraft. It's an interesting look, and these Century wings are really well done aircraft models. They're mostly metal. I like how if you want to go in the air-to-air mode, there's actually plugs you put in the wings so there's not a big gap for the pylon. And they give you both the 2, or I should say the 1 and the 2 shape for the side. You can either go with the old school straight or the Y-shaped. And you get Zuni missiles for the cheeks if you want them. Just having fun, and the Marines flew these too for a number of years. As for the A7, I picked up the Gemini a long time ago, and then when Century brought theirs back, I picked up the A7D a few years back, and then actually quite recently I picked up the Navy A7E, and I'm glad I did because it is different than the Gemini, and I like that it actually came with the same kind of bomb set as the Air Force, at least as far as the big racks. I'm trying to look for them. Yeah, here they are. No, actually I think these are off Intruder. Either way, Century is pretty good about giving extra options and ordnance and differing them up, and being all metal, opening canopy, removing pilots, gear up or down, moving tails. I don't know, I'm just having fun with them. There was also a tanker version, or excuse me, no, not tanker, I'm thinking of the A6. It's been a long video already. It's talking about the F8. I was thinking of the RF8. I would like an RF8, the reconnaissance version, because those actually stayed in the service into the mid-80s and played a very important role in the Vietnam War as well as the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that'd be the only one I'd like to add. Otherwise, I feel pretty good about my little fleet. What do you think? These aren't often thought of today, but were a very important part of the Navy, and much to their chagrin, Air Force's arsenals for a time. Anyway, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, there's a Mishaco Patreon. With that, this is Misha. Catch you very soon, next time.